So I have an hour to share with you 40 years of experience. It's obviously an impossibility. So I'm going to try to focus in on the key points that I think is most relevant for the people in this audience. And then I'd like to do at least 15 minutes of questions and answers to hone in on things that hopefully you have questions about. So I titled it Undue Influence, but I wanted to start by asking this question for you to ponder. Those of you who may have read one of my books, I asked this question in a variety of forms, probably in Combating Cult Mind Control. It was, how would anyone know if they were under mind control? Now I'm using more undue influence because it's a legal term and it talks about exploitative influence. But how would anybody know if they were under mind control? And that's what I'm hoping. Yes, did you want to? They would not. I mean, I was in a cult for 2.5 years. I was recruited when I was 19. I was an upper junior at Queens College, New York. My girlfriend had dumped me. 3 women flirted with me. And 2 weeks later, I was bowing to an altar with a Korean Messiah's picture on it, believing that he was my true father and his second official wife and 400th sexual victim was my true mother, and that my real parents were my physical parents, and worked 21 hours a day, 7 days a week to set up a theocracy to take over the world and abolish democracy and make Korean the one language on planet Earth. And how could a nice Jewish boy from Queens, a conservative Jewish family, have such a radical change in his personality and his belief systems? And honestly, my family tried to argue with me and to explain I was in a cult and I was brainwashed, and I didn't feel brainwashed. I felt like I was having a spiritual experience, that God had selected me, that Satan was the god of this world and I needed to follow God, and I would save my family and my family's lineage in the spirit world and set up the kingdom of heaven on earth where there would be no war, no poverty, no crime. We would all be brothers and sisters and be happy. That wasn't the fantasy. And it wasn't until I fell asleep at the wheel of a fundraising van, drove into the back of a tractor trailer truck at 80 miles an hour, needed 30 minutes to be rescued where they thought it would blow up. I landed in the hospital. During that time, I slept for the first time in 2.5 years. I was sleeping, 9, 10 hours a night for a few weeks. Some of my real self surfaced. I reached out to my sister. I wasn't wanting to leave. I still was totally indoctrinated. But I missed my sister tremendously. I called her. She said, come and visit. I was a leader. And I made her promise not to tell my parents, and she broke her word, thank goodness. And they did a deprogramming intervention with me, and it was in the context of that intervention that I more or less wanted to prove to my family I wasn't brainwashed, I wasn't under mind control, and I wanted to dispel any of their fears, and so I voluntarily agreed to meet with the folks who were ex-Moonies when I had recruited into the cult. And it was in that context that I was exposed to Robert J. Lifton's book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, which he was one of 4 top mental health professionals during the 50s that military intelligence sent to study brainwashing. The term was coined in the 50s during the Korean War. And in his book, which was the declassified version was published in 1961, he outlined 8 criteria that any environment may be judged as a brainwashing, or he preferred the term thought reform environment. And as the ex-Moonies went through the 8 criteria with me, it was really obvious that the family, that was the name of the group that we called ourselves, the Unification Church, the family, we did all of those things, which made a big confusion in my mind because communism was Satan, we were God, but Satan does these brainwashing techniques, but God is doing these brainwashing techniques. It was really a conundrum. And more or less, I had a snapping experience in my deprogramming where it was like a light switch went off, and all of the doubts, all of the contradictory experience popped up at once, and I realized Moon's not the Messiah. Once I could cognitively get to that grasp that he wasn't the Messiah, therefore he was a liar, therefore the whole system that I'm going to just fast forward a few slides, that's Moon and his wife. The garb is their own. Mass wedding. Thousands of strangers. He'd line up the men and the women and say, you and you. You and you. You'd have 5 minutes to decide if you want God's choice for you. Most everybody did that. There would be a ceremony where they would hit each other with a stick 3 times on their buttocks as hard as they could. There's lots more. I don't want to spend the time, but just to tell you how weird my experience was and why I'm here as a mental health professional wanting to share this information, because it gave me a window into a world of undue influence and mind control in cults. And if it hadn't happened to me, I never believe that any intelligent person from a nice family who was educated, I had no trauma in my childhood. It was boring. Honestly, I feel guilty and sometimes with all of my clients because I wasn't beaten, I wasn't tortured, I wasn't raped. We lived in the same house. My parents married as virgins. They didn't have affairs. They didn't smoke, drink, gamble. Boring. But because it happened to me, it was became a passion to understand it. And I sought out Robert J. Lifton. I'm going to just advance a few slides to show you a picture of him. I actually called him up. He was teaching at Yale. I said, I want to talk to you. What about? Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. He said, that old book? And that was 15 years old at that point. I said, yes. He said, why? Because I just got out of the Moonies and it rescued my life. And he more or less said, I've only studied it secondhand, but you've lived it. They did it to you, and as a leader, you did it to other people. Study psychology and explain it to people like me. And in therapy, we call that a reframe, where instead of me being the victim, now I'm an expert. One of the top experts is saying, you know more than me. What? You're a Yale psychiatrist. But he empowered me, and I'm very grateful to him. And so very quickly, I want to give you the answer to this as I see it from my 40 years of work. And then I want to get into the nitty-gritty of how to tell and talk about some of the key points that you will probably want to know about. Essentially, you wouldn't know, but what you need to do, or what one needs to consider doing, is get away from the environment, which means get away from the controlling person, if it's a cult of one, and there are these micro-cults all over, called narcissistic, abusive husbands or wives, who have isolated from your family and done a lot of manipulation and mind control. Get away. For a minimum of a week. A month is better, 3 months is better, a year is even better. But then study models of mind control, right? Because if the question is, how would you know if you're under mind control, you need to study the Lifton 8-part model. Singer has 6 conditions. And I've taken those models and created what I refer to as the BITE model, which you should have handouts. Do you have in front of you? Great. And in my latest book, I put all of these models that I'm going to be speaking about. And for those of you who don't have the book or whatever, my website is freedomofmind.com. You can go under articles, click Byte Model, and you can see the same slides that we're going to be doing shortly. But literally go through the models, then reflect over your own experiences honestly. go back before you met the group and say and check off on the checklist how many of these criteria fit your experience. And once you start to do that, here's the zingers. Seek out ex-members and critics, because when you're in a mind control environment, they don't want you to talk to ex-members. They don't want you to talk to critics. They want to control the information so they can control your thoughts. And when I was in the cult, I was told people who fell away from God were possessed by Satan. They'd become drug addicts or sex addicts or any number of horrible things. And another mention in this book, I have a chapter on phobias, that the most common phobias I've encountered in my practice in 40 years. Things like, if you leave, you'll go crazy. If you leave, you'll get cancer. If you leave, you'll be hit by a car. If you leave, pages of the most common phobias. Talk to people who've left, and none of those things happen to them, because now they're the walking cure, and all ex-members are the walking cure, and which is also why they're so dangerous, the cult leaders, and why they don't want you to talk or read what they have to say. Reflect honestly on what they're saying and what your experiences are, and then you'll be in a position to start answering the question, was I under mind control? Oh, and a really good question is, if I knew then what I know now, would I have ever said yes to the recruiter? A lot of people, they're caught up and kept so busy in the cult mind control indoctrination, they don't go back in time to their pre-cult identity and say, who was I then, and what did I actually think I was getting involved with? And in my case, I wanted a date. I was not interested in dropping out of college and cutting off from my family and friends. In fact, they lied to me and they said that they were students, and they weren't. And they said they weren't part of a religious group, and they were. So once I could get back to the beginning lies, then everything fell into place. This really was a mind control cult. I'm rushing, but I really want to get to a lot of things. We've talked yesterday about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's one of a national shame that America has not signed this. I think there are 2 countries in the world that have not signed this. But I really encourage you to go on un.org and read, because if a group is allowing and encouraging you to have all of these, then you're probably not in a mind control cult, because you need to have freedom to think, freedom of choice, freedom to read what you want to read, freedom to meet whoever you want to meet, freedom of education, freedom of medical treatment, all the things that Child Friendly Faith Project is about. I showed you a little bit of this. I mean, I met the man many times. I was groomed to be the top American leader. And Charles was saying he saw me on the clip on CNN. I was actually talking about ISIS as a cult. And I've since heard from counterterrorism experts who said you're absolutely right. All the governments are not discussing mind control as a methodology of how these groups recruit and indoctrinate. We need to incorporate that knowledge. I'm not holding my breath that anyone's going to act on that interview. I did a Huffington Post blog. Someone asked me yesterday, what is a cult? There are many definitions. Some religious organizations define a cult by any group that doesn't follow the Bible. That's a cult. But my definition is based on Lifton's work and human rights definition. So I talk about any authoritarian pyramid-shaped relationship or group that uses deception and recruitment. So there's no informed consent. Very important concept. That uses behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. Where are we? Behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control to create a new identity, a dissociated identity that suppresses your authentic self and makes that new identity dependent and obedient on the leader or on the group. So there's this feeling and experience. For me, it was Steve Hassan, son of Milton and Estelle Hassan of Flushing, Queens, and Steve Hassan, son of Sum Young Moon and Hak Jahan, the true parents of the universe. And the real me was suppressed. The real me was suppressed by the cult me through the methodologies that I'm going to review. It doesn't erase it, though, and that's the key to my whole work in helping people to recover and get out of cult groups and mind control groups, is that I really believe the human spirit wants to be free, wants to know the truth, doesn't like to be abused, doesn't like to be lied to, wants real love, not pseudo-love that a lot of these groups and relationships are promising. Oh, I love you, but the person who's saying it has no capacity for empathy and therefore has no capacity for love in the real sense of the word love. Am I talking too fast? How am I doing? I'm trying. I feel like I'm racing. So for me, this is a process-oriented kind of litmus test that anyone can test any type of situation, whether it's a political group, a therapy relationship or group, a religious group, a person, a large group awareness training, a multi-level marketing group, so many different applications of these. And probably one of the most important things I want to convey to you is this notion of a continuum, to really think about influence as ethical, constructive influence and destructive, unhealthy influence. Understand that there are poles to orient one's thinking about this. The healthy side, it respects our uniqueness as people, our individuality, our free will, our authentic self. For those people of faith, especially of the Abrahamic religions, I cite the Adam and Eve story, and I talk about however you understand the Bible or however you want to read that story, God could have made Adam and Eve robots, slaves, mind control zombies, if Almighty God wanted to. But because the story is so clear that God didn't want to do that, it's a fundamental message of the divine plan that we're supposed to have choice, that we're supposed to be unique. We're not stamped out coins that all look the same way. Each one of us has a divine creative spark. I'm getting emotional. And talking about healthy families and unhealthy families, we can use the same kind of schema to talk about healthy parents recognize the child as a unique being, and their charge is to help that unique being grow up to be their best self. And on the unhealthy side, the parent wants the child to be a mirror image of them or a clone of them and make them think the right way and feel the right way and act the right way. And in psychology, we refer to that as having a false self. Same model, but it can be applied in so many different. And of course, in terms of organizations, healthy ones have transparency, they're accountable, there's honesty, there's checks and balances to avoid abuses of power, informed consent, checks and balances, transparency, encourage growth. And on the extreme unhealthy side, they want obedience. Overall, obedience, conformity, dependency. Healthy religious groups, love-based. Unhealthy ones, fear, guilt, control-based, right? So it becomes really obvious if you start thinking about things in terms of this way. There's censorship and doctrine over experience, unwiring your conscience. And kids are pretty darn clear from the beginning. This is wrong. You know, I was watching the powerful movie last night, All God's Children, and the kids were all saying, this was horrible, this was terrible. How could they do this? How could our parents do this? They knew it was wrong, but their parents were, in my opinion, mind-controlled into believing they had to sacrifice themselves for the higher purpose. and behave this way. And I want to remind especially the younger people in the audience, November 18th, 1978, we had a demonstration of parents shooting cyanide-laced Kool-Aid into 276 children's mouths, killing them for God, because Jim Jones said he was. And it's, again, a demonstration of the power of mind control, that it can subvert parental conscience and parental strong feelings of wanting to protect your child. So these extreme negative organizations are typically pyramid, authoritarian, ends justify the means, closed to preserve power, and back to the bite model. So, again, this is on my website, it's in my books. I'm going to read a few key ones, but regulating the person's physical reality, telling them who, where, and whom they can associate with, who they can have sex with. There's typically, in some groups, changing their names, changing their clothing, their hairstyles, their diet, manipulating sleep. I want to take a moment to talk about how sleep deprivation is one of the most researched areas in the mind-body connection. And we need 7 to 9 hours of sleep to function properly. I was living on 3 to 4 hours a night. And unfortunately, America's society, last I heard, the average person sleeping 5 to 6 hours a night. So as a society, we're sleep deprived. It makes us vulnerable to mind control, because we're not thinking clearly. Financial exploitation, restricting vacation in the Moonies, leisure, entertainment. Major time spent with group indoctrination and rituals. I was praying maybe 3 hours a day. And unlike what Charles was saying, you talk with God, you ask questions and stuff. I'd be saying, Father, we need to save the world, Father. And we'd be telling God everything that the cult had indoctrinated in our head to do, and to give us the power and the hope to recruit more people, make more money, influence the satanic government, take over America. A lot of prayer manipulation and a lot of music used as a mind control device too. I love singing, and there were holy songs in the Moonies that would just encourage that indoctrination. Even when you weren't with the group, you were singing Heavenly Soldiers, etc. That's one of their songs. Permission required for major decisions. You have to report your thoughts, feelings, and activities, especially if you're having any deviant ones, because in my former cult, Satan was everywhere, and evil spirits were trying to possess you always. And Satan worked through the ones you loved the most, so we were especially alienated from family members. Lots of behavior mod, rewards and punishments, discourage individualism. It's evil to think your own thoughts. You should think God thoughts. You should think from God's perspective. Impose rigid rules and regulations, instill dependency and obedience. This is probably the most important one that summarizes behavior control. And because we were mentioning developmental psychology, and going back to the continuum of what's healthy development of self and what's unhealthy. Basically, destructive cults want to keep people eternally as children. They don't want them to grow up and individuate and think for themselves and have their own thoughts and their own feelings and have their own free will. So you're eternally dependent and obedient, and if you have any other thoughts, it's labeled as deviant. Information control. If there's one quickie way to evaluate a new group or something that comes your way, some friend, some family member, some coworker, it's about information. Because information is the tools we use to think and to how we can do good decision making. And the unhealthy groups are always going to either withhold information, distort information, or lie, just outright lie. Oh no, we're not religious. Heavenly Father, please save Steve from Satan. Oh, we're not religious though. But again, the ends justify the means. So members do it in good faith because they want to save these people's souls, right? But and your best defense is being a good consumer and asking lots of questions and asking the hard questions. I like asking things like, so tell me, is your group considered to be controversial by anyone? Of course, you can't ask the question in a very hostile way. It has to be like, recruit me. I'm open. Oh yeah, people say all kinds of things. What do they say? Oh, they say we're a cult. Oh, why is that? Tell me more. Tell me, who is your founder? And these days, back when I was recruited in 1974, there was no internet. So we really didn't have information. Now we have the internet, and what I'm experiencing in 2014 is that all the big groups have legions of cult members on the internet, putting out disinformation, posing to be ex-members, clogging search engines. So be a good consumer means don't just settle with a Wikipedia answer or the first 10 hits on any particular group. Learn to do advanced searches like the name of the leader in quotes, plus scam, brainwashing, cult, ex-member, criminal behavior, and search 100 pages deep at least. Information control. So the paradigm, and I want to go back to one of my first books that I read as I was 76, 77. There was a huge book called The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, hardback book, this big. 90% of it was blacked out. It was published blacked out. And I was like, that's interesting. And if anyone wants to know more about the whole military intelligence mind control piece, you can ask me when I'm doing questions and answers. But key things are, don't talk to these evil former members. Don't read that apostate literature, this negative literature. These days, cult leaders and cults are tracking their members through phones and texts and everything else. So it's made it very hard to do interventions. Compartmentalization of information, outsider information. You can read all these things. They're on your handouts. Spying on each other, and you can go back to reading about Nazi party and the kinds of behaviors. It was a mind control cult. Period. On every level. People turning in their family, turning in their best friends. Lots of propaganda, unethical use of information, control of feelings. Creation. Now there's a lot of manipulation of memory, creating false memories. I thought I had an abused childhood, my Mooney self. It's very interesting, and I can tell you story after story of clients with that. So thought control, another telltale sign, black and white, us versus them, good versus evil, very, very extreme. Loaded language, buzzwords that constrict thought and feeling. Members do what we call thought stopping, where you have proper thoughts. So I was taught to chant or pray or sing a song to get rid of any doubts that may come into my mind. Hypnotic techniques. So one of the many books that I hope to write in the near future is on the use of hypnotic techniques. And I'll just say that hypnosis isn't just the stereotyped look at a watch going back and forth, your eyes are getting heavy. It can be that, but it's much more slick, much more sophisticated, and in fact there are hundreds of people on the internet willing for a fee to teach you how to covertly hypnotize people. Particularly if you want to rape people, they'll teach you how to do it covertly, unfortunately. I've yet to get any law enforcement or have any media being willing to take that story on, but there are clients of mine, former clients of mine, who have experienced that rape. Memories are manipulated. I talked about the thought stopping, rejection of critical analysis. And what I say to a lot of my clients is, I wish that Moon was the Messiah. I wish the Garden of Eden could be established and we would have no crime and no poverty. But wishing it doesn't make it true. It doesn't make it like it's ever going to happen. Being in the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's never going to happen. Scientology, no. The body thetans from Xenu's galactic dictatorship are not going to be exorcised off of your body. It's a use of imagination against one's authentic self for control, power, money, and sex. That's the universals. Power, money, and sex control. Emotional control. On the one hand, you're special, you're chosen, you're better than anyone else on the planet. God loves you and like nobody else, and mostly you suck. You're not good enough. You have to work harder. You have to repent more. You have to pray more. So tons of guilt and fear. And as I mentioned earlier, I have a whole chapter on phobia indoctrination. So the key thing to understand about phobias is that our brain is organized to save us, to protect us from harm, and that protection system can be tricked to believe that things are harmful when they're not harmful. And that's the difference between a legitimate fear and a phobia. All mind control groups, in my experience, put irrational fears in members' minds as a device to control them. And teaching people what is a phobia, how to fix a phobia is step one. It's in chapter 10 of the Freedom of Mind book. Then here's a critical point. When you're in a cult, as you've heard me say at least 3 times so far, you don't think you're in a cult, but you think other groups are cults. So as a Moonie, I knew Scientology was a cult, the Christians were a cult, Children of God were a cult. So the second step of the phobia cure is to talk about one of these other groups that the person accepts is not a healthy group, and explain how that group installs phobias in people's minds to keep them dependent. Get the person to say, oh, it's really obvious, they're just using that fear to keep people in that group. And then you turn it around, you ask people, so is there a legitimate reason that anyone can leave your group? And here's another technique, long silences after you ask a good question. Because the average person will wait 1 to 3 seconds. If they don't get a response, they move on to something else. And it's one of the key points I say to all my clients. They need time to chew on that, up to 5 full minutes, not 3 seconds. And training people to be patient and wait after they ask a good... Do you know anyone who's ever left and's happy? That's 10 seconds. Feel how long it is? It's a long time. But that's part of the process, what I refer to as the strategic interactive approach of how to understand how people are programmed. And if you understand it, you understand the Achilles heels of how to help the person to help themselves get out. And so I frame my work as not rescuing people from cults. I frame it as empowering people to think for themselves and make their own decisions, which is a critical shift in the paradigm. And I think it's a true shift. So understanding that 3-step phobia intervention is huge. And now threats of harm to ex-members and families. For those people born into cult groups, the threats are real, many of them, that if you leave, we will never talk to you again, you will never see your grandchildren again, etc. So there's a huge exit cost, is the term that I've heard used, about that, and that keeps people in for years and years and years, even though internally they're so burned out. Roger and Joellen were talking last night, and it took them years to get out once they started realizing this is not a safe environment because of some of these incredible phobias and threats. A couple of key concepts I want to touch on. Cognitive dissonance theory. I know Lisa was talking about, I believe in your talk, cognitive dissonance theory, about dissonance between different thoughts. As I understand Leon Festinger, who was one of the originators of the concept, he was talking about thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and how we want to have internal consistency between our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. But the key to change is shifting one of them incrementally, which is how cults recruit people, shifting them incrementally in order to help them come to a new point of view or understanding. It's an important concept in understanding. Typically, if I had more time, I would be teaching you about the Ash conformity study, the Milgram obedience study, the Zimbardo obedience study, the Zimbardo prison study, and talking about how we are, as biosocial beings, hardwired, programmed to conform to people in our environment, and programmed to conform to who we perceive to be legitimate leaders, and how we're hardwired, programmed to operate on scripts, social scripts. And what a lot of these destructive relationships and recruiters, traffickers, Islamist terrorist recruiters are playing on is creating moments of confusion and then giving a new set of instructions for how to resolve the dissonance, and in a sense controlling the frame of who you are or what it is that's meaningful to you in your life. So it's technical, but believe me, it's understandable. And all three of those studies, the Ash, Milgram, and Zimbardo, refer to the single most important principle in social psychology called the fundamental attribution error. And what social psychology basically says is this error is when we look at a person and say, why are they doing what they're doing, we over-attribute personality variables or internal variables, and we underestimate social influence variables. So what all of social psychology is teaching is we are socially malleable. And we adapt. That's part of our strength as a species. And now we have, with all of the research into the brain, we know about neurogenesis, we know about neuroplasticity. And in fact, that's the key to helping victims of mind control. And here's my one-liner. That if you want to write a one-liner for those of you who are ex-members or work with them, it's the way to recover from destructive mind control is to learn to control your own mind. In other words, instead of looking outside to some external authority figure to define reality for you or tell you what you're thinking or feeling, go inside and get to know the real you. And learn the techniques of how to control your own mind so you're not controlled by thoughts, you're not controlled by feelings, you're not having the cult indoctrination going off as a tape recording or as a CD recording, an MP3 in your head, but learn how to identify a trigger and undo a trigger. I'll say very briefly, it's really very fast to do. Unfortunately, without this body of knowledge and without this specialized counseling information, and people go to mental health professionals, they get trauma therapy, but the trauma therapist doesn't understand this is a lot more detailed than a simple trauma or even a complex trauma. And essentially what I teach my clients to do is develop an observational or witness perspective when you feel this trigger. What was it? Was Was it an image? Was it a word? Was it a smell? Was it a taste? Was it a feeling? Identify the trigger. And then ask the question, how do I want to respond to that? Or how do normal people respond to that who were never in my cult? And then rewire your brain. Are you following what I'm suggesting? Okay, 10 minutes. So when I got out of the group, moon was a trigger word. People would say, look at the moon, it's beautiful. I'd be kneeling before Sun Myung Moon on a concrete floor, looking up at Master and freaking out because I didn't want to be back in the cult. And I needed to do this technique on myself to identify the trigger and say, how do I want to respond to the word moon? Oh, I want to see the moon, that satellite that goes around the Earth. And I had to literally say the word, see the picture, say the word, see the picture, see there's a full moon, a half moon, a quarter moon, over and over, and rewire my brain. So when people say, look at the moon, yeah, it's beautiful, and there's zero cult connection. And when I wanted to think of a former cult leader, I called him Mr. Moon in my mind, and I made this tiny little picture in my head of him behind bars, and this was years before he went to jail. And I call him Mr. Moon. And it's these types of understanding how the mind works and rewiring based on the here and now, being in your body, moving forward. As I think I heard the Reverend say this morning, don't use your own trauma history and impose it. Heal yourself. These are some of the techniques to not be in the past where the destruction was done, but to cultivate a healthy, resourceful point of view. But let me just say that my approach is essentially taking everything I've learned and using it to help empower people to think for themselves and make their own decisions. In other words, on that continuum, I'm meeting with family and friends and therapists and clergy members and anyone I can find, creating an ethical team that's dedicated to empowering the person to understand what's happened to them. So I'm advocating a legal, ethical influence, systematic influence process to help somebody leave an abusive cult or mind control relationship as a cure. And with that, I will open for questions. Thanks. In terms of the bite model, not much difference, except that there's not a Bible. Thank you so much. There's not a Bible, there's not a religious ideology in some cases, although in some cases there is. There's an extraordinary number, by the way, of people who were born in cults who've left and never gotten help, and are doing their own infliction of a version of what they were programmed with in their childhood on their future victims, so that there's this multiplication effect of victimization that's going on out there. But yeah, it's a different model than the mind control model is a different model than traditional viewpoints on domestic abuse. For me, it's educating people in the here and now, and then let's go back to find out family of origin issues, or if there was previous abuse from a parent, or sexual abuse, or something like that. It's the big error, in my opinion, that most mental health professionals take with abuse victims is they go back to the beginning and tell me about your family of origin instead of getting details about, tell me about the last 10 years, or have you ever been in a high demand relationship or group. Stay away from probably the word cult unless they bring it up. And I use a lot of stories, personal stories and stories of other clients. I like to cite movies and TV shows to empower people to look at these things and then report back to me what made sense, what connected or not. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but domestic abuse survivors have read especially combating and just said, wow, it's, you were describing my ex-husband or my ex-wife. Other questions? It really comes down to getting a detailed history of the particular group or the particular thing, and using what I have learned as modeling what has worked in the past with other people. I'd want to interview former members and understand where are the hooks and such. But one of the things of the strategic interactive approach that's so unique is what's referred to as a complex systems approach, which my ex-brother-in-law is president of the New England Complex Systems Institute, so I've had my training from the early 80s on this, but thinking on multiple levels at the same time, and not just thinking if I, the daughter, or I, the ex-member, are trying to reach out and it's not working. I'm thinking, who else is that person interacting with, and how can I find someone in their sphere, or how can I hire someone to go into that person's sphere to find out what's going on inside the group, to find out what's going on inside of that person. And what I do with my clients is try to customize advice. Ultimately, mind control relationships and cults don't work. In other words, people do resist, they get resentful, they don't like to be abused, etc. So, and the key to a faster resolution is more healthy people in the person's life. And as I was mentioning before, instead of saying get away from that group or get away from that person, having people say, oh, you know, let me tell you about my story. I was with an abusive person who had done it, and it took me years to get it, that he's a narcissist, and that narcissists can say they love you, but they don't know, they can't experience love because of an attachment disorder in their childhood. And by the way, there's a narcissist who's very famous named Sam Vaknin, V-A-K-N-I-N, who's written a book called Self-Malignant Love. He's done a lot of free YouTube videos, and I regularly recommend the following video, especially to single men and women. It's called How to Spot a Narcissist or a Psychopath on Your First Date. And it's pretty stereotypical, but he nails a lot of the dimensions. And just for someone to watch something like that, it often goes, wow, it rings a bell. Yeah. Other questions? We have to wrap up? Oh, we have to stop. I'm so sorry, but thank you, everyone. I want to kudos to Janet and the Child Friendly Faith. Thank you.